It's an honor to present our featured speaker this evening. Judith Butler is Maxine Elliott Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature in the Critical Theory program, a renowned philosopher who can claim household name status. Judith Butler has been extraordinarily influential in a wide range of fields, including political philosophy, ethics, literary criticism, feminism, gender and sexuality, queer theory, and critical theory. She is also the current president of the Modern Language Association, making her the ideal person to address all of us gathering tonight to celebrate the library's Languages of Berkeley exhibit. Judith Butler is the author of many groundbreaking books, and I will cite only a few here, such as Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, published in 1990, Bodies That Matter, On the Discursive Limits of Sex, published in 1993, Excitable Speech, from 1997, Who Sings the Nation State? Language, Politics, and Belonging, co-authored with Gayatri Spivak in 2008, and recently, Senses of the Subject and Notes Toward a Performative Theory of Assembly, both published in 2015. Her current projects include work on messianic gestures in Kafka and Benjamin, philosophical fictions in Freud's work, and gender in translation. Judith Butler has received numerous awards and academic honors, including the Theodore W. Adorno Prize from the city of Frankfurt, the Brudner Prize for Lifetime Achievement in LGBT Studies from Yale University, and the Andrew Mellon Award for Distinguished Academic Achievement in the Humanities. The French Ministry of Culture has named her a Chevalier dans l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres, and the British Academy has named her a Corresponding Fellow. A longtime activist in gender and sexual politics, human rights, and anti-war politics, Professor Butler is now, as president of the MLA, the lead advocate for languages in the US. She is here this evening to talk to us about the promise of multilingualism. Please welcome Professor Judith Butler.
Wonderful. I'm very pleased to be here this evening. And thank you for the introduction, Rick. During such dark and uncertain times, it's a pleasure and an honor to take this occasion to affirm how lucky we are to be part of a public university where more than 60 languages at any given moment are being taught in one corner of the university or another. It would be a great achievement and something of a wonder to simply stand here and name all those languages. We've heard from some of them already today, and I thank you so much for your wonderful readings. I note that it's especially important during these difficult times rife with xenophobia and nationalism, to affirm the multilingual university because, as we know, the calls for obligatory monolingualism at the state and local level in many places in this country, but also now in the post-Brexit UK, reflect a narrow idea of national identity and undercut the many values of multilingualism, including the complex view of the world, broad and textured, that it provides. In a way, all of our senses are inflected differently depending on the language through which we approach the world. And by that, I don't mean to say that we each, according to the language we speak, approach the world in a way that cannot be shared. On the contrary, the public university at its best is the site where this encounter among languages takes place, one that both deepens our sense of local cultures and broadens our understanding of a complex world. In the 27 years that I have taught at UC Berkeley, I've been amazed to walk through the campus and hear any number of languages spoken at the same time. This has never been an experience of chaos or dislocation. Multilingualism is our location, and it means that we never assume that one language holds the truth over any other. At UC Berkeley, and in this library in particular, in language courses and literature and history courses, students and faculty alike understand themselves to be part of an ongoing multilingual experiment, one that brings with it different histories and cultures, different ways of understanding the social world, but also, for some of us for whom English is a first language, a promising experience of feeling that the assumption that English is at the center of the world has been productively challenged here. You might think, well, English has established itself as a lingua franca, no matter how paradoxical that sounds, and one cannot get far, we could say, without having English these days. But that's only to describe the power that English has achieved. It doesn't describe the reality to which it lays claim. If we were only to work in English, we would misunderstand our world. Monolingualism keeps us parochial, even if the language we speak has achieved global dominance. At UC Berkeley, I found it especially interesting to meet students over the years who were explicitly asked by their parents not to learn their heritage language at home, to speak only English, since English was considered the ticket to assimilation and success. The idea that a monolingual education would help second-generation children in this country is understandable, and yet it misses the great promise of multilingualism in this world to counter the ignorance and fear that thwart our understanding of each other and the complexity of our world. But there's more. One of the first moves on the part of many of those second-generation students upon arriving on the UC Berkeley campus is to dart over to literature and language classes to learn their own heritage language. That was a longing, apparently, that no education in monolingualism could extinguish. And in departments like comparative literature, where I live, we find time and again that the student who learns their heritage language comes to appreciate the various elements of language learning and goes on to learn yet another language, often graduating with competence in, say, 4 or even 5 languages. It's one thing to speak with your grandparents in Mandarin or in Spanish, or indeed in Yiddish, as I was asked to do, but quite another to learn the poetry and prose written over centuries in those languages, and to construct an essay in that very language which represents the full force of your intellectual powers. My wager is that many parents feared that a child would be confused if they were to speak and hear more than one language at home or learn more than one language at school. Research shows that that is not true, and that what is true is that moving between languages builds a facility to shift between syntax and framework, to move between worlds of meaning, and to consider more knowledgeably the very different perspectives on the world that are generated through different languages. Perhaps a second misconception is that employers and universities will not value bilingualism or multilingualism, but what could be more valuable? Fields committed to translation and to multilingualism are more inclusive and stand to benefit from that range of perspectives. Monolingualism, on the other hand, limits the number of regions that can participate in a field and so restricts the contribution to knowledge itself. Take, for example, one of my own fields, gender studies. I came to see over time that scholars working in Anglophone regions assumed that if they could clarify a concept in English, that the concept was therefore clarified once and for all, and that it had a general applicability, even a presumption of universality. But that has turned out to be a dangerous habit of cultural imperialism. Such a view reminds me of a French scholar I once met who confessed that she regarded any foreigner who made a grammatical error in French as an irrational person, as somebody incapable of rationality. She thought that French grammar was the structure of thought itself and could be universalized. An imperial presumption, to be sure. My wager is that lesser-known languages do not make that presumption. There is no one language that refers to objects, for instance, more fully and completely than any other. No one language monopolizes the referent, just as no one mode of representation, no one medium truly grasps the nature of gender where others fail. Gender as an English term arrives only with great difficulty in languages other than English. There is resistance, coinage, refusal, assimilation, but almost always the term itself causes, well, some trouble. So if we refer to gender as a noun, a category that you check, or the kind of being you think you are, we're already making all sorts of presumptions that don't translate easily. The proliferation of noun forms for both gender and sexual identity raise specific problems for translation in, say, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. Consider, for instance, that there's no noun form for gender in Japanese. There are terms for women and for men, but not for the concept of gender itself. Indeed, in Japanese linguistic self-reference takes place through inflection. The terms ore and boku are informal ways of referring to the first-person singular I of a man, while atashi and watashi are first-person references for a woman. The use of each of these terms, however, is inflected by social class, educational background, cultural conventions, and importantly, the relation to the one who is addressed by that speech act. Although what in English we would simply call gender, or some of us would, operates in complex ways, implicated in formal and social modes of address, coordinated by power, in Japanese the complexity at work is not designated by an equivalent term. The closest Japanese gets to approaching this non-translatable word is a coinage, genda, which is not unlike the French coinage gender, by seeking a phonetic echo with gender. In German, one sometimes uses the term Sozialgeschlecht, social sex, and in Chinese, that also emerges as one possibility. And as I understand the challenge of translating gender into Chinese, it has involved coming up with a conjunction of phonemes and numbers. The term for gender is Jing 4 Bei 2. The numbers denote tones, and there are 4 of them for each of the 2 terms. Thus, Jing 2 means something very different than Jing 4. Indeed, this Roman system that I'm using is already a translation of Chinese characters, so makes something of a grid out of a graphic sign. Jing 4 is a term meaning category or kind, but it also means sex, and so sustains a relation with those languages like German that link sex to species. Some feminist scholars in China put the term social, and here just pardon my pronunciation, She 4, Hui 4, before the term Jing 4, Bei 2. Bei 2 means difference, thus linking with those formulations of gender, linking it to a kind of sexual difference that wavers at best between the biological and the social. It would seem that gender theory can only benefit from a multilingual understanding of the ways that gender as a term does not work in every context, in fact, sometimes remains fully untranslatable. Rather than assimilate those linguistic differences into English, should we not approach gender theory as a practice of translation, a necessary translation in order to counteract the imperial gesture of assimilation into English, which is accompanied by the presumption that anything clarified in English is therefore clarified for the world? Indeed, in this world, irreversibly multilingual as it is, there can be no gender without translation, and where the term gender is non-translatable, another lexicon, or indeed another syntax is called for. And that is truly interesting. At least I think so. Multilingualism provides, I would suggest, a horizon for our teaching and our research, not just because we come from different linguistic backgrounds, but because the knowledge of our world is built through the encounter. Indeed, a university that supports instruction in foreign languages helps to build that more complex and capacious understanding of our world. And a library that preserves and purchases foreign language texts and publications support those fields and lets all of us benefit from literature, philosophy, history, scholarship from every field, from the history of world cultures and global forms of knowledge in the plural. I don't know if plural is really the right word. Should we think of the world as a cultural or linguistic plurality? Well, that model tends to keep languages distinct side by side, But what about the encounters between languages, contact made, and transformations that take place as a consequence of those encounters, whether through translation or interpretation? Languages affect, change, and alter one another. They bear the traces of past encounters and confrontations, wars, and histories of cohabitation. They carry the histories of colonialism, resistance, revolution, and new beginnings. I remember a bad moment in this country's history when the younger President Bush was criticizing the socialist government then in power in France, and he announced that the French did not even have a word for entrepreneur. He said it. I can't imitate the way he pronounced it, but okay. I thought it was a sublime joke. I was ready. I thought, he was joking. Sometimes he did joke, and maybe it is now, but at the time it was radically unfunny. I say this because a certain imperial smugness goes along with monolingualism. It keeps one, arrogantly centered in one's own world, but also, in the case of English, it allows one to presume that whatever is said in English is simply said, that its truth and validity, its applicability, is to be presumed as globally true. In one course I taught, we read Rousseau on the origin of languages. At one point, he argues that words, he has many inconsistent accounts in that book, so this is just one strain. He accounts that words emerge for humans through imitating the sounds of animals, or rather that human sounds, especially in their most passionate forms, are indistinguishable from those of animals. Those so-called natural sounds, which are not yet words, he tells us, are composed of accents, pure accents without consonants. Only when the hard edge of consonants are articulated do sounds start to verge on words and we become capable of speech. He insists that natural sounds not only emerge from passion, but that they imitate passion. And if we want to know what the sounds of passion are, they would emerge from the throat. They would be accented vowels, I presume, and inarticulate sound in his words, that is to say, sounds that are not yet speech. On that same page, he mentions onomatopoetic expressions, which sound like the thing to which they refer. The words give the impression of being derived from what they describe. So when we say in English that a cat says meow, we think that this term truly resembles what a cat says, that the word simply registers the actual sound that the cats make. If Rousseau is right here, the onomatopoetic phrase shows that some forms of language stay proximate to nature, and that they imitate or correspond to sounds that exist before, merely bringing those sounds into an articulation. But is he actually right? And is his argument wrong because he subscribes to a form of monolingualism that fails to consider the various ways that language works? For instance, does the sound meow resemble what the cat actually says, or is it a conventional way of naming the cat's sound, one that comes to structure and frame the acoustic possibilities for hearing the cat? If meow does not resemble the cat necessarily, then it may be that the word, the convention, structures our hearing and interprets the sounds that we receive from the cat. To test this thesis, let me ask a few questions of you, especially all of you who have spoken here today. What do cats say in your language? Any more? Mao? Louder? Oh, that's a good one. Others? Male. Okay, well we have some changes, right? At least we had some. I had 16 languages represented in that particular classroom, and there were some true distinctions to be made. My presumption is that you were probably led to believe that the word by which you name that sound is the same as the sound the cat makes, or pretty nearly the same. My local experiment is meant to make an old argument, one that we find in the Tower of Babel itself. There are many languages, and if we seek to construct a single language that absorbs and overcomes linguistic difference, we deny something quite fundamental about the world in which we live. Monolingualism can be a parochial position, one that affirms that the language spoken is one of many, but the only one that is valuable to speak. Or it can so overinflate that value that it becomes a position that asserts the dominance of that one language over all others. But if the multiplicity of languages is inevitable and irreversible, where does that leave us? Well, where it leaves us is, I think, with a sense that our languages structure reality differently, and we can, through the act of translation, understand something of that difference and traverse that difference to some important degree. I would also suggest that it drops us off right here at UC Berkeley. At least on this campus, as I've experienced it, we have the chance, especially through learning languages and literatures, to build a different sense of the world, one in which we all experience a certain dislocation and enriching humility by finding ourselves less capable in another language than we are in the primary one that we speak, if we have a primary one. We become, as it were, children together as we start to learn a new language. It's embarrassing. We make terrible errors. We become children again. Errancy is the name of that game, and only those who are willing temporarily to seem like fools have a chance to learn another language. It feels like being an infant all over again, and we try to make this sound and that sound when everything in the mouth strains to go in another direction. It is as if a new language remakes the mouth, the tongue, the throat. And those of you who've taught languages know that you sometimes have to get people to use a part of their body that they've never exercised before. Yes, we presume English in most of our classrooms, but not in all, and English is never presumed to be the only language spoken on campus. When states and localities seek to outlaw the speaking of foreign languages, they not only demand a conformity to English, I'm going to say that because the UK is doing it in a post-Brexit frenzy, and we know that the US has done it as well, but they seek to silence those whose first language is Spanish or Arabic or Turkish or Japanese. In other words, they seek to deny the multilinguistic character of the nation and its borders, its history and its future. And in suppressing the sounds of those languages, it seeks to deny the reality of those histories and an enduring fact of a multicultural population that challenges the false and dangerous idea of a nation purified of what is foreign. During times of extreme and intensifying xenophobia, it is most important to remember that English is not the center of the world, even if it often assumes that it is. This world has, in fact, many centers, and what seems like the periphery from one perspective is the very place of enduring life, lived seen from afar. Oddly enough, the same can be said about first languages and foreign languages. For many of us at UC Berkeley, English is a foreign language. Yet each and every one of us speaks a language that is foreign to someone else. So what we call our own language is always relative. We all speak a foreign language. The language we speak is foreign to someone. So we could say that every language is a foreign language to someone, and in this world we cannot presume that the language we speak is everyone's language. That imperial presumption works through censorship and suppression by banning spoken Spanish in the US or by excluding the foreign and the foreigner, travel bans, and racist migration and asylum policies. And during these times when xenophobia, the fear of foreigners, of the foreign, educational institutions have an ethical and educational obligation to dispel prejudice, foster equality, and produce the libraries and classrooms that give us all the opportunity to resist that lethal contagion. We need these places, these resources, in order to stop and think and analyze, to take apart those forms of cultural and national arrogance that propagate hatred and fear. In learning another language, we practice humility in an effort to gain knowledge and to live in a broader world, one that exceeds the national boundaries that too often divide us. That passage through humility gives us greater capacity to live and think within a multilingual world, to shift from one way of knowing to another. At least here, at least potentially, what we call the foreign is actually the medium in which we live together, the enigmatic basis of our worldly connection with one another. The foreign is our work, if not our vocation, since we are expanding our understanding of the world's history and culture as we come to know and affirm the multilingual expanse of this world, which is its promise to move beyond and against the kinds of nationalism that make our borders sites of violent suffering. It may not be that multilingualism alone promises an alternative to violence, but it can challenge arrogance and nationalism. It can cultivate humility and understanding. And those public virtues are not the ones we see on display on this sad day in our country. For that reason, on this very day, we are lucky to be here, affirming another vision of a world, another promise. Thank you very much.